Most men don't lose because they are weak. They lose because no one ever told them the truth at the right time. What I'm about to say is not comfortable, and that's exactly why you need to hear it. If you are an older man, or becoming one, this message is not here to motivate you. It's here to wake you up. Because there is a version of you that is quietly being formed right now, whether you're aware of it or not. And that version will either command respect effortlessly or be ignored despite everything he's done. Here's the brutal reality. Age does not automatically give you power. In fact, for most men, age only exposes what was missing all along: the insecurity, the need for approval, the emotional reactions, the wasted years chasing the wrong things. But for a small group of men, something very different happens. They reach a point where they stop explaining themselves, they stop chasing validation, they stop reacting emotionally. And suddenly, the world starts treating them differently, not because they demanded respect, but because they became impossible to dismiss. This video is about what those men do differently, internally, psychologically, and philosophically. Not the surface level advice you've heard 1,000 times, not discipline cliches, not empty confidence talk. This is about the quiet shifts that turn experience into authority. The mental decisions that separate men who grow bitter from men who grow powerful. The behaviors that make people listen when you speak, notice when you leave, and feel your presence before you say a word. Most people will never understand this. Some will hear it and still do nothing. But if you stay until the end, you'll recognize exactly where you are and what needs to change if you want to win consistently, calmly, and on your own terms. This is not for everyone. But if it's for you, you'll know. At some point in a man's life, something quietly but profoundly shifts. It's not announced. There's no ceremony. It usually happens after disappointment, after being overlooked, after realizing that effort alone does not equal respect. This is the moment older men who eventually win begin to separate themselves from everyone else. They stop chasing approval, and instead, they become undeniable. Most men spend a large portion of their lives trying to be chosen by employers, chosen by society, chosen by women, chosen by friends. And while ambition isn't wrong, the psychological trap lies in needing that choice to feel valuable. Approval becomes a substitute for self-definition. When that happens, a man unconsciously hands his power away. He becomes reactive instead of grounded, performative instead of authentic. Older men who win recognize this pattern because they've lived it. They've tried to impress, they've over-explained, they've overgiven, and eventually life teaches them something brutal but liberating. The world does not reward desperation, even when it's well disguised. It responds to certainty. It responds to presence. It responds to a man who is not asking to be validated by the room, but who would remain unchanged even if the room disappeared. This is where the transformation begins. When a man no longer needs applause, he stops performing. When he stops performing, he starts becoming precise. His words slow down. His decisions become cleaner. His energy becomes contained rather than scattered. People often mistake this for indifference, but it's not. It's self-respect taking shape. Psychologically, approval seeking is rooted in fear. Fear of rejection, fear of invisibility, fear of being insignificant. But maturity introduces a different question. What if rejection isn't a threat, but a filter? Older men who win stop fearing disapproval because they understand that not everyone is supposed to have access to them. This alone changes how they walk into every interaction. They are not there to be liked. They are there to be aligned. And alignment is powerful. When a man is aligned with himself, he doesn't rush to prove his worth. He lets consistency speak. He understands that credibility is built over time, not negotiated in conversation. He knows that explaining yourself repeatedly is often a sign that you are not being lived, but argued. So he chooses embodiment over explanation. This is why his presence feels different. He listens more than he speaks. He doesn't fill silence with nervous energy. He doesn't compete for attention. He understands that attention follows depth, not volume, and depth can only be cultivated when a man is comfortable standing alone in his values, even when they are unpopular. There's also a philosophical maturity here that younger men rarely grasp. Older men who win understand that life is not a popularity contest. It is a responsibility contract. You are responsible for your body, your mind, your time, your word. Approval does not strengthen those things. Discipline does. Integrity does. And when a man begins to live by his own internal standards instead of external applause, something fascinating happens. People begin to trust him, even if they don't fully understand him. Trust is born from predictability rooted in principles, not from charm, not from constant reassurance, but from knowing that this man will not abandon himself for acceptance. That kind of self-loyalty is rare, and rarity creates gravity. Another critical shift occurs here. Older men who stop chasing approval also stop resenting those who receive it. They no longer compare themselves to younger men, louder men, flashier men. Comparison loses its grip because it requires the same external measurement system that approval depends on. Once a man opts out of that system, comparison collapses. He starts competing only with his previous level of discipline, clarity, and courage. This internal competition sharpens him. He becomes less reactive to praise and less wounded by criticism. He understands that feedback can be useful without being defining. Praise no longer inflates him, and criticism no longer destabilizes him. Emotionally, this is profound stability. It allows him to move through life without constantly recalibrating his identity based on how others respond. And here is the uncomfortable truth many people avoid. The moment a man stops chasing approval, he becomes selective. He no longer tries to be understood by everyone. He invests his energy where there is mutual respect. This selectivity can feel threatening to others because it removes the illusion of access. But it is also what makes him magnetic. Scarcity is not created by withholding artificially. It's created by having standards that limit availability naturally. This is why older men who win often appear calm even in uncertainty. They are not frantic because their sense of worth is not up for negotiation. They don't need immediate outcomes to feel secure. They trust process over perception. They know that long-term consistency always outperforms short-term validation. From a psychological perspective, this is where authority is born. Authority is not dominance. It is coherence. When a man's actions, values, and boundaries are aligned, he doesn't need to assert himself aggressively. People feel it. And when people feel it, they respond differently. Conversations shift, dynamics recalibrate. Respect emerges without being demanded. This doesn't mean these men are emotionally closed or disconnected. On the contrary, they are deeply self-aware, but they understand that emotional expression without structure leads to chaos. So they regulate themselves. They choose when to engage and when to withdraw. They understand that availability without discernment depletes value. The most powerful aspect of this transformation is that it is quiet. There is no announcement that a man has stopped seeking approval. He doesn't tell the world he has changed. He simply moves differently. And over time, people notice. They may not articulate it, but they feel the shift. He no longer bends. He no longer overextends. He no longer tries to convince. He allows reality to do the talking. And reality always tells the truth. Older men who win understand that being undeniable is not about force. It's about coherence sustained over time. It's about becoming so grounded in who you are that external reactions lose their ability to destabilize you. That is not arrogance. That is earned confidence. If there is one thing to take away from this, let it be this. The moment you stop asking the world to validate you is the moment you start building a life that speaks for itself. When approval is no longer your currency, integrity becomes your wealth. And integrity, sustained long enough, makes you impossible to ignore. Once a man stops chasing approval, the next shift is almost inevitable. He begins to draw lines, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. This is where older men who win separate themselves even further from everyone else. They develop boundaries that are non-negotiable, and they stop explaining them. Most people misunderstand boundaries. They think boundaries are ultimatums, arguments, or emotional speeches. In reality, boundaries are decisions you make with yourself before anyone else is involved. They are not about controlling other people. They are about controlling access to you. And psychologically, the moment a man understands this, his entire relationship with the world changes. Younger or insecure men often believe that explaining their boundaries will make them more reasonable, more understood, more accepted. But what they don't realize is that over-explaining usually signals uncertainty. It sends the message that your standard is flexible, that your no might become a yes if the pressure is applied correctly. Older men who win have learned, often the hard way, that respect erodes the moment you start negotiating your self-respect. So they stop. They don't announce their boundaries in advance. They don't threaten consequences. They don't try to educate people on how to treat them. They observe. They allow behavior to reveal intent. And when a line is crossed, they act quietly and decisively. Access changes, energy shifts. Availability decreases. No drama, no confrontation, no emotional outburst. This calm enforcement is what gives their boundaries weight. There is a deep psychological principle at work here. Human beings do not respect what they can repeatedly violate without consequence. Every time a man tolerates disrespect to avoid discomfort, he trains people to see him as optional. Older men who win understand that short-term discomfort is a small price to pay for long-term dignity. What makes this difficult is that boundaries often trigger guilt, especially for men who were conditioned to be agreeable, helpful, or endlessly patient. But guilt is not a moral signal, it's an emotional reflex. It shows up when you stop abandoning yourself to maintain harmony. Older men who win feel the guilt and move forward anyway because they know something crucial: peace that costs you yourself. Respect is not peace at all. Another uncomfortable truth is that boundaries will cost you people. Some will misunderstand you. Some will label you cold, distant, or difficult. But older men who win are no longer afraid of these labels. They understand that people who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always resist your growth. Losing access to you feels like punishment to them, but it is simply alignment for you. This is where the no explanation part becomes critical. When you explain your boundary, you invite debate. When you justify it, you invite judgment. When you defend it, you place yourself on trial. Older men who win refuse that courtroom. They don't argue their reality. They don't plead their case. They simply live their decision. And paradoxically, this restraint creates authority. People sense when a man is emotionally regulated enough not to react. They feel it when he doesn't need to prove he's right. Silence, when backed by consistent action, is far more powerful than the most articulate argument. Over time, others adjust their behavior not because they were convinced, but because they learned. This approach also filters relationships naturally. The people who remain are those who respect limits without resenting them. These are the relationships that last, because they are built on mutual regard rather than emotional exploitation. Older men who win are not surrounded by crowds, but by clarity. There is also a philosophical depth here that often goes unnoticed. Boundaries are an expression of identity. When a man knows who he is, he also knows what he is not available for. Confusion about boundaries is usually confusion about self. As self-knowledge deepens, boundaries become simpler, not stricter. They require less explanation because they are no longer reactive, they are rooted. This is why older men who win appear unbothered when others push back. They are not surprised by resistance, they expect it. Resistance does not mean the boundary is wrong, it means it is working. And because they are no longer dependent on external approval, they can withstand that resistance without collapsing into anger or retreating into appeasement. Another key aspect of this maturity is consistency. Boundaries mean nothing if they are enforced selectively. Older men who win do not bend their standards based on who is in front of them. Power dynamics, attractiveness, familiarity, or emotional history do not override self-respect. This consistency builds an internal trust. And when a man trusts himself, his nervous system settles. He becomes calmer, clearer, and harder to manipulate. This internal calm is often misread as emotional distance. In reality, it is emotional discipline. He still cares, but he no longer bleeds for everyone. He understands that empathy without limits turns into self-betrayal. So he chooses discernment over guilt, restraint over reaction. It's important to understand that boundaries are not punishments. They are responses. They are information. They communicate. This is where I end, and you begin. Older men who win do not use boundaries to control others, but they also do not allow others to control them. This balance is rare, and that rarity commands respect. Over time, something remarkable happens. People stop testing. Conversations become cleaner. Interactions become simpler. Drama dissolves not because it was confronted aggressively, but because it no longer finds a host. The man becomes a place where chaos cannot land. And this is why boundaries without explanation are so powerful. They remove emotional leakage. They conserve energy. They signal self-trust. They teach others how to engage without a single word being spoken. If there is a final thought to sit with, let it be this: every time you explain a boundary to someone who has already crossed it, you are not teaching them. You are doubting yourself. The moment you stop justifying your limits is the moment your life begins to feel lighter, quieter, and more aligned. Respect doesn't come from being understood. It comes from being consistent. After a man has stopped chasing approval and has learned to set boundaries without explanation, there is a third transformation that quietly locks everything into place. This is where real power stabilizes. He masters emotional control and becomes unavailable to chaos. Most people misunderstand emotional control. They think it means suppressing feelings, becoming cold, or disconnecting from life. That's not what this is. Emotional control is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of choice. It is the ability to feel without being hijacked, to experience anger without becoming destructive, to feel disappointment without collapsing into resentment, to witness chaos without joining it. Older men who win understand something psychologically profound. Whoever controls the emotional temperature of an interaction controls the outcome. The person who reacts the most loses the most leverage. And this is why emotional discipline is one of the rarest and most respected traits in adulthood. You see, chaos feeds on reaction. Drama requires participation. Conflict needs emotional fuel. When a man responds impulsively, raises his voice, over-defends himself, or explains himself in frustration, he becomes predictable. Predictability makes him manageable. Older men who win refuse to be managed emotionally. They pause. That pause is everything. In that pause, they assess instead of assume. They observe instead of explode. They decide instead of react. And this pause creates distance between stimulus and response, which is where maturity lives. Most people never develop this space. They live inside their impulses. Older men who win step outside of them. This is why they don't argue unnecessarily. They don't chase closure. They don't need the last word. They understand that not every emotional invitation deserves attendance. Declining chaos is not avoidance, it is discernment. There is also a deep self-respect embedded in this behavior. When a man reacts emotionally to every provocation, he communicates that others have access to his internal state. Older men who win guard that access carefully. They do not hand emotional authority to people who have not earned trust. This is especially important in relationships, work environments, and social hierarchies. Emotionally reactive men are easy to destabilize. A single comment can throw them off course. A single rejection can spiral them into self-doubt. Older men who win have experienced this version of themselves before, and they outgrew it because it was costly. They realize that emotional chaos drains energy that could be invested in building something meaningful. So they became selective. They don't surround themselves with people who thrive on drama. They don't engage in conversations that revolve around gossip, outrage, or constant dissatisfaction. Not because they think they are above others, but because they are protective of their mental environment. Just as you wouldn't eat food that poisons your body, they refuse emotional input that poisons their mind. This emotional filtering sharpens them. They become calmer under pressure, more stable in uncertainty, less reactive in conflict, and this stability changes how others experience them. People feel safer around them. They feel steadiness. They feel containment. Even when disagreements arise, the emotional ground remains solid. There's a philosophical layer here as well. Emotional control is an acceptance of reality as it is, not as one wishes it to be. Older men who win stop fighting reality emotionally. They stop saying, "This shouldn't be happening," and start asking, "What does this require from me now?" This shift moves them from victimhood into agency. They no longer waste emotional energy on what they cannot control, other people's moods, choices, or perceptions. Instead, they focus on what is always within reach, their response. And this focus creates an internal locus of control that is deeply empowering. Another critical distinction is that emotionally disciplined men do not confuse calmness with passivity. When action is required, they act. When a line is crossed, they respond. But their actions are clean, not fueled by emotional overflow. They are deliberate, proportional, final. This is why they don't revisit the same conflicts repeatedly. They resolve internally first. Once a decision is made, it's not reopened emotionally. There is no lingering bitterness, no replaying conversations, no rehearsing arguments in their head. They conserve emotional energy by refusing to relive what has already been decided. This conservation is what allows them to focus long-term. Emotionally reactive men live in cycles. Same arguments, same triggers, same exhaustion. Emotionally disciplined men progress forward. They close chapters properly. They grieve losses fully, then move on without dragging emotional residue into the next phase of life. This doesn't make them emotionless. In fact, it often makes them more compassionate. Because when you are not overwhelmed by your own emotional noise, you can actually listen. You can hold space without being consumed. You can empathize without absorbing. But compassion without chaos requires boundaries and control. Older men who win understand this balance intuitively. They don't confuse emotional expression with emotional leakage. One is intentional. The other is uncontrolled. And here is the part most people don't expect. Emotional control makes a man deeply attractive. Not just romantically, but socially and professionally. People trust those who don't implode under stress. They respect those who don't escalate unnecessarily. They gravitate toward those who remain steady when situations become uncertain. This steadiness becomes a form of leadership, even when the man holds no formal authority. Leadership, at its core, is emotional regulation. The ability to remain clear when others are overwhelmed, to stay grounded when others panic. Older men who win embody this quietly. They don't need titles. Their presence alone organizes the room. Ultimately, mastering emotional control is about self-sovereignty. It is the refusal to outsource your internal state to external events. It is choosing dignity over drama, clarity over chaos, response over reaction. And if there is one thing to reflect on here, let it be this. The moment you stop letting chaos dictate your emotions is the moment your life becomes quieter, stronger, and more intentional. Power does not shout, it steadies itself. And from that steadiness, everything else begins to align. By the time a man reaches this stage, after he has stopped chasing approval, after he has learned to set boundaries without explanation, and after he has mastered emotional control, there is one final shift that defines whether he truly wins or merely survives. This is where experience is no longer carried as weight, but sharpened into precision. This is where older men stop becoming bitter and start becoming exact. Most people grow older, but very few grow wiser. The difference lies in how pain is processed. Life inevitably disappoints. Trust is broken. Effort goes unrewarded. Expectations collapse. Many men carry these experiences like unresolved debts. They become cynical, guarded, emotionally rigid. That bitterness slowly leaks into how they see people, how they speak, and how they move through the world. And without realizing it, they begin to repel the very respect and connection they crave. Older men who win make a different choice. They don't deny pain, but they refuse to let it poison them. They extract information from it. Every failure becomes feedback. Every betrayal becomes data. Every loss becomes a lesson in discernment. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" they ask, "What does this reveal?" This is psychological maturity at its highest level. They understand that bitterness is not strength. It is unresolved grief disguised as wisdom. Precision, on the other hand, is clarity earned through experience. It is knowing exactly where to invest energy and where not to. Exactly who to trust and who to keep at a distance. Exactly what patterns repeat and what signals never lie. This is why older men who win stop romanticizing potential. They have seen it too many times. They've watched people promise change and repeat the same behavior. They've invested in ideas that sounded inspiring but lacked structure. They've waited for growth that never came. And eventually, they learned the difference between hope and evidence. They don't dismiss potential entirely, but they no longer build their lives around it. They build around patterns, because patterns are honest. This makes their decisions faster and cleaner. They no longer hesitate endlessly. They don't need excessive reassurance. They don't get trapped in analysis paralysis. Their precision allows them to move decisively because they trust their judgment. That trust didn't come from confident speeches or motivation. It came from paying attention when life spoke. There is also a deep humility in this precision. Older men who win are not arrogant. They know how much they don't know, but they are no longer naive. They don't confuse kindness with access. They don't confuse charm with character. They don't confuse intensity with commitment. They have seen enough to know that consistency is the only real currency. This is why they become selective without becoming closed, open-minded without being gullible, warm without being careless. Their emotional doors are not locked, but they are guarded, and that balance creates a sense of safety around them. People feel that this man sees clearly, that he cannot be easily fooled, but also cannot be easily shaken. Another critical shift here is how they relate to time. Bitter men rush, resent, and replay the past. Precise men respect timing. They understand that not everything is meant to be forced. They allow things to unfold while staying prepared. They don't panic when results are delayed because they are no longer proving anything to anyone. They are building quietly. Precision also changes how they speak. They say less, but mean more. They don't overpromise. They don't dramatize. They don't exaggerate their struggles or their successes. Their words carry weight because they are backed by lived reality. When they give advice, it is grounded. When they set expectations, they are realistic. When they commit, it is intentional. This is why people listen to them differently. There is also a moral clarity that emerges here. Older men who win stop blaming the world. They take responsibility without self-attack. They acknowledge their role in past outcomes without drowning in regret. Regret is transformed into refinement, and refinement is power. They don't repeat the same mistakes because they didn't just experience them, they studied them. They didn't numb the pain or rush past it. They sat with it long enough to understand what it was teaching. That understanding becomes discernment, and discernment is what protects them moving forward. This is also where resentment dissolves. Bitter men stay emotionally tied to the people who hurt them. Precise men release that tie, not through forgiveness performances, but through indifference earned by clarity. When you truly understand a pattern, you no longer need closure. You have comprehension, and comprehension frees you. Older men who win don't waste energy trying to be right about the past. They focus on being effective in the present. Their lives become simpler, not because life got easier, but because they stopped complicating it with illusions. They no longer chase intensity. They value stability. They no longer crave constant stimulation. They value depth. They no longer confuse movement with progress. They value direction. And here is the quiet truth: at the center of all this, precision is attractive because it signals self-trust. A man who trusts himself does not need to dominate, impress, or control. His certainty is calm. His presence is grounded. His decisions are final. This is why older men who reach this stage seem unbothered by what unsettles others. They are not numb. They are simply no longer surprised. They have seen enough to know what matters and what doesn't. And that knowledge allows them to invest fully where it counts. If there is one thing to take with you from this, let it be: this age will give you experiences whether you want them or not, but wisdom is a choice. You can carry your past as bitterness, or you can sharpen it into precision. One makes you heavy. The other makes you dangerous in the quietest, most powerful way.